Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. My name is Richard Page. I'm the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Studies in the College of the Liberal Arts. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the launch event for this year's college theme, Moments of Change, A Century of Women's Activism. In particular, I'd like to welcome the 18 college alumni who came back on campus to be with us today. As many of you are aware, the 19th Amendment, which made it unconstitutional to deny someone the right to vote on the basis of sex, was ratified in 1920. And March 2020 happens to be Women's History Month. And today happens to be Super Tuesday. So I think it's the most appropriate time for us to talk about women's activism. And I would like to thank the College Steering Committee for the great work they did in organizing this launch event. Thanks also to the library for hosting the launch event, and to the faculty and staff of the library and the College of the Liberal Arts for all the work they have done to set everything up. Please give them a round of applause. If you haven't done so already, please check out the exhibit in the Mann Assembly Room. While there, you can go by a station run by our student chapter of the League of Women Voters and register to vote. So even though it's Super Tuesday, we vote in Pennsylvania on April 28th. So students, you'll still be on campus. Register and vote if you haven't done so already. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Clarence Lang, the Susan Welch Dean of the College of the Liberal Arts, who will introduce our theme and the moderators for the launch event. Clarence?
Okay, thank you, Richard. And thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. I'm certainly excited to help launch this year's Moment of Change theme, A Century of Women's Activism, and I'm certainly inspired by the opportunities that this moment brings. The starting point for the century upon which we reflect, or will be reflecting, is the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was part of a, I'm going to argue, long process of extending the vote to women that continued further along into the 20th century. Moments of Change gives us the opportunity to reflect not only on the important role that suffragists and others played in making the 19th Amendment a reality, but also the transformative role that women's activism has played in advancing gender equity and as well as expanding the meanings of democracy more broadly. I want to add that this also provides a chance to examine women's multiple overlapping identities in terms of class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, religious expression, nationality, as well as gender. Did you just throw up a 1-minute card on me? Is that you? Okay, they're running a tight ship here. Okay. I was like, I know I didn't see that. Okay, all right. So this is all to say the category woman is not a unitary one. I'm proud of the interdisciplinary and intersectional nature of this endeavor that's bringing together so many voices within and beyond the liberal arts. I'm also proud of the fact that we have elevated Moments of Change from an undergraduate theme to a college theme so that all of our students, as well as our faculty, staff, and alumni, have a chance to take part and contribute to this important discussion. And I look forward to seeing where these conversations take us as we move forward. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our co-moderators for today's event. May I do that? Okay. Dr. Shirley Moody Turner and Kathleen Cahill. Dr. Moody Turner is an associate professor of English and African American Studies, an affiliate faculty with University Libraries, and a author of the book Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation. She is also founding co-director of the new and still as of yet unnamed Center for Black Digital Research. Dr. Moody Turner's work focuses on recuperating often hidden forms of black women's intellectual, literary, and social activism. She is currently leading a collaborative cross-institutional digital project on black feminist, intellectual, and activist Anna Julia Cooper, who, if you don't know more about her, I hope that you will learn more about her. Dr. Cahill is an associate professor of history and affiliate faculty of the college's liberal arts, that is, Richard Civil War Era Center. Her teaching and research focus on the working and political lives of American women, and she asks how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. Dr. Cahill's latest book is entitled Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Mainstream Suffrage Movement. This is a collective biography of 6 suffragists, which will be released this fall. And so with that, Shirley, Kathleen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and we want to echo the thank you to the steering committee and to the library. This has been a really fun, collaborative effort. Before we get started on our brief discussion, I want to pause and acknowledge that where we are today, and actually all of the Penn State campuses, have deep indigenous histories, that we are on the ancestral homeland of the Erie, Seneca, Oneida, Lenape, Shawnee, Munsee, and Susquehannock nations. And thinking about that, since none of us are talking about Native women's activism today, I'd like to give you sort of an action item, which is when you're, after our talk and when everyone adjourns to the man room to see the pop-up exhibit, right next door, and in fact the doors will be open, is another exhibit on indigenous roots and routes. And it's sort of an overview of the Penn State collections, but it includes, and I think importantly, writings by indigenous suffragist Zitkalasa or Gertrude Bonin, and also really demonstrates the wide range of indigenous women's activisms over the last several centuries and into the present, the land dispossession and cultural repression that they fought against, and as well as their advocacy for sovereignty. And so we're really delighted to have this panel that's a mix, a range of professors, graduate students, undergraduates, and so we'd like to just frame it a little bit and then turn it over for the session.
Oh, thank you. So I have just a few more comments to kind of add to what Dean Lang and Dean Page have already said in terms of framing this event. But I'm going to keep it really short because if Dean Lang got the 1-minute sign, I know I'll get the hook. So I am going to keep it short. But we did want to say just a little bit more about the theme for this year. The theme for this year is Moments of Change, a Century of Women's Activism. And the theme was selected in an effort to recognize the significance of the passage of the 19th Amendment as we near the centennial of its ratification. But it was also chosen in an effort to understand the battle for the vote in much broader and longer terms. The passage of the 19th Amendment was a culmination of generations of struggle. And of course, that struggle didn't end with the amendment's passage. At the time of its ratification, millions of Americans remained disenfranchised. And so the programming that will take place throughout this year is intended to make visible the different forms and complexities of that longer struggle. It also asks us to consider the many types of women's activism, the broad range, kind, and location of women's activism that was entangled with, but also went beyond the fight for suffrage. And given that it's an election year and our current political climate, it seemed an especially critical time to reflect on what people have sacrificed for the vote, how the vote continues to be restricted, suppressed, and denied in ways that are often meant to go unnoticed, to be normalized, and to be overlooked. And we are excited about this year's theme because it calls on us to recognize, learn from, and build on a rich and complex and ever-evolving tradition of women's activism.
I wanted to just very briefly mention that we're using the term woman to be very broad and inclusive. And this kickoff event is just sort of a sampler. It's an appetizer plate, right? To think about, give you a sense of the broad conversations we hope to have this year. These panelists and the talks were chosen on the basis of folks who volunteered, right? So this is not the entire purview, but again, just enough to whet your appetite to, as Dr. Moody Turner said, the wide range, the long time span of activism and advocacy for rights and social justice. So
So with that, we are going to very smoothly transition to our first presenter, who will be Dr. Cahill, and her question. So every presentation is framed by a question. So the presenters were asked to think about, one question that they could put out and speak to that question in 5 minutes. So the idea is that you'll be able to kind of think about and kind of take notes on those questions, and then we'll have opportunities either here or more likely in the man room to revisit those questions. And Dr. Cahill's question is, what did the Chinese Revolution of 1911 have to do with the American women's suffrage movement?
Thank you. All right, 5 minutes. All right. So these are two topics that you don't normally hear discussed together. Am I echoing? I think I have 2 mics on. Does that sound okay? All right. When we include, thank you, Chinese women in our discussions of suffrage activism, the answer reveals a transnational story that affected the women's movement in both the United States and in China. So what I need to start with is briefly explaining the position that Chinese people held in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Most white Americans held incredibly strong and problematic stereotypes about the Chinese. They were seen as too foreign, too heathen to become American citizens. There were a very small number of Chinese women in the United States at that time, and they were almost universally believed to be prostitutes. And their bound feet signaled that Chinese men were barbarians who kept their women subordinated. And the result of these ideas were a series of laws beginning in 1882 that excluded the vast majority of Chinese people from immigrating to the United States and banned anyone who was able to immigrate from becoming a naturalized citizen. You or me, I can't. Sorry. There we go. All right. So after the Chinese Revolution of 1911, and this is not the Communist Revolution, that happens later. This is the Republican Revolution that overthrew the Qing Empire. After that, rumors spread to the United States that the Republican government had enfranchised Chinese women. White suffragists in the United States were really shocked by this news. It doesn't match those stereotypes. So they immediately tried to find Chinese women in their communities to tell them what was going on. And those women were really happy to comply. And in cities across the country, from Portland, Oregon, to Cincinnati, Ohio, to New York City, white suffragists met with Chinese suffragists to learn more about this. And those speakers were happy to talk about the role of women in the Chinese Revolution, as well as their hopes for the new republic. And that's what the white suffragists wanted to hear about. But they also used their platform to speak out against U.S. policies that harmed Chinese people in the United States. So the strict exclusion policies, as well as those, the racism and prejudice against their communities. And just to give you this sense, in the New York City slide, at the podium is Anna Howard Shaw, who's the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the top leader in the nation. And the Chinese women who speak, Mrs. Pearl Lu Lin with the children had been held in an immigration facility for several months in San Francisco. And then Mabel Lee, the woman, her mother is sitting and she's standing behind her. She's a young high school student who advocated for educational opportunities for Chinese children in New York. Impressed by these speeches and seeing the political potential of their stories, white suffrage leaders invited them to participate in this massive parade they were planning in 1912. This is a really famous moment in suffrage history. And not just participate, but you can see Mabel Lee over here. And you can see her. She's asked to be in the front in this, with these other writers. And her picture and name appear in newspapers nationwide. The other women from Chinatown also march in a different section carrying banners that say, "Light from China," which is a play on the term benighted heathens or benighted China that Americans often used. So this is a carefully choreographed parade, and right behind those women from Chinatown is Anna Howard Shaw, again, carrying her own banner, which says, "NASA, keeping up with China," right? Catching up with China. And this is alluding to this unusual role reversal and urging American men to fix it, right? White Americans are supposed to be the modern nation, but here China seems to have beaten them. And this story keeps attention all year. Shaw tours with her banner, and then in the fall, Carrie Chapman Catt is on a world tour. She visits these Chinese suffragists in China and writes about her experiences. Mabel Lee, who had helped lead the parade, enrolled at Barnard College, and her experience, I think, helps explain a little bit of why we don't often hear about this. There are a number of Chinese students in the United States on something called the Boxer Indemnity Fellowship Scholarship Program. Mostly men. They were training to be economic and political leaders who would go back home and build the new nation. Again, people like Mabel, who was born in China, couldn't become U.S. citizens, and so really put a lot of their effort in speaking to this community of students. And you can see her article here that's based to them. And encouraging sort of women's rights in China, right? Thinking about building that new nation. She does not return to China, but many, many other Chinese women who were involved in this do. So, to sort of sum up, I argue that finding stories of suffragists of color really opens up our narrative. In the case of Chinese women, it demonstrates that suffrage was a transnational conversation, and not just one with Britain across the Atlantic, but that also stretched across the Pacific. These women also gave white, or sort of the larger suffrage movement, new arguments, though they're often problematic. And more importantly, these Chinese suffragists used the platform that they gained to advocate for the issues that affected their community in the United States. These are not the only stories. There are many more, and I encourage us to find them. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Kathleen. And we will now invite our next presenter, Dr. Amira Rose Davis, to the podium. And Amira is Dr. Davis is the Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies. And her question is, how do you find and write the histories of the Black women's movement?
Great. Thank you so much for all gathering here today. If you know anything about me, you know brevity is not my strong suit. A real moment of change here. Off to a great start. Anyways, so the work that I want to talk a little bit about today is the larger histories that are being written about Black women's activism. This field has been in formation for a few decades now, and so we actually have a really rich historiographical kind of collection. So I just brought a few readings to kind of demonstrate some of these things. Tara Hunter's To Join My Freedom starts with the 1881 Black washerwoman strike in Atlanta, a great example that really becomes the foundation of a lot of these histories we're talking about, and really pushes back on the notion that Black women were not political actors, or, and really importantly for what I'm talking about today, that their archives weren't there. That even if they were historically political actors, there was no way to document their lives, their labors, their activism. Thank you, Kevin. I want to, of course, highlight Danielle McGuire's Dark End of the Street, particularly about the way that she centers Black women and then tells us, and then pushes the question, what does that mean now that they're central to the story? And so this recasts known things that we're familiar with, like the Montgomery bus boycott, by revisiting a moment on the stage with Rosa Parks in the wings, asking, should she say anything to the congregation that has gathered on the eve of the boycott, in which she is told, you have done enough, you have said enough, you can be silent. Which immediately pivots to her being used as a silent symbol. With dignity, she was tired, all these things that had largely obscured her own activism as a rape justice activist, but also the organizing done by Black women in Montgomery who were saying we're staying off the buses not just because of racial injustice, but because of the indignities that we face when waiting for the bus, particularly on our bodies as women. And so one of the things that Danielle's work points us to is that it's not just about finding these moments, but saying, what does this change about history we thought we knew? And just two more examples of this. Great anthology about women in the Black power movements have come out, and then work like Rhonda Williams that looks at Black women's organizing, rife with oral histories in public housing. And so the way I access this history of Black women's activism is largely through athletics, and so I just want to take the remainder of my time to look at a little bit about moments of some of my historical actors to see, A, how their historical significance might have been obscured, and then what lessons they leave us with. So this is Wilma Rudolph. You might be familiar with her. She's a great Black History Month poster. That's where a lot of people remember her from childhood. 3 gold medals at the Rome Olympics. She won one before that in 1956. She didn't walk without assistance until she was 12. She won her first medal at 15. She also had a baby 18 months before she won 3 golds at Rome. There's a lot that we don't know, even if we start scratching the surface. One of the things that I want to zone in on about her life today, though, is the way that things that she did were framed in a way that has prevented us from seeing her as an activist. So the first one is that top picture. She returns home from Rome in her tiny town of Clarksville, Tennessee, wants to hold the parade in her honor. She learns that it's going to be a segregated event, and she refuses to show up unless they integrate it. Right? It becomes one of the first integrated events in Clarksville, Tennessee in 1960. And this isn't framed as such. It's barely reported as such. But that's one window into that. The second is one of my favorite images. She is leading a direct action protest on a local diner, again in Clarksville. When Black newspapers, mainstream newspapers didn't really pick this up. Black newspapers, when they talked about this, they said, poor Wilma finds out that she received a Jim Crow key to the city. Think about that framing. She's not an active participant. She's a victim. It allows, and what the Black newspapers did at the time, used that as a moment to rally the troops around her, as if she wasn't on the front lines leading the movement herself in that instance. This is Rose Robinson. Rose Robinson refused to stand for the anthem in 1959 Pan American Games, and then went on to refuse to be a political pawn in Goodwill Trips. Robinson's significant because she stages a hunger strike after she's jailed for tax evasion, largely in retaliation of her refusing to go on this State Department-sponsored trip as an athlete. And one of the things that I found in my work is the Black newspapers, when they're reporting this, say there's a Black woman athlete wasting away in prison because of these policies. But a lot of her archives are actually with the peacemakers. They understand her historically to be a pacifist. And so if you go looking for Black women's athletic activism, you would miss this story. Because in the historical record, she's understood as a war activist and not necessarily an athlete, despite her own telling of her story. And that goes into Tyus, who I'll leave to my colleague to talk a little bit more about. But if you remember our Moments for Change event 2 years ago, when we brought Tyus to campus along with Tommy Smith and Harry Edwards, you got a little glimpse about her story in 1968, also protesting at the Olympic Games in Mexico City. And Tyus is really great because she leads us to one of the points I want to make, that sometimes you just have to listen to Black women. This memoir that just came out 2 years ago, she had been trying to write since 1970. She joined Wilma Rudolph, Althea Gibson, as other Black women who were able to get a platform for their words to be out, which is largely how I know some of this history, along with oral histories. And I'll just end by talking about how sometimes just reading a little bit more into our sources allows us to access this as well. On the whatever side of that one is, you see an article that is talking about a summary of the revolt of the Black athlete, and it includes a quick phrase that says, and almost every time the Black athlete is fighting for trivial, parentheses, Black cheerleader, right? And so it's cast as trivial, a throwaway. But if you stay on that moment, and you stay on that point, and you say, well, there's enough activism around Black cheerleaders that they noted it, even if they framed it as trivial, that was the moment that, for me, I said, oh, I can pause and dive in. And admittedly, I didn't think to do that until Black cheerleaders started protesting in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick in the last few years. When I control-find on my computer for moments of Black cheerleaders activism, I had so much stuff. Immediately could write an article about it, and I have. And so this is just a showing that sometimes those moments are the instructive moments. And immediately I found things like this in my hard drive that was about a Black cheerleader saying they want our boys to play on their teams and win games for them, but they don't want our girls to cheer for them. We're Black, we're proud, and we're out here to get our demands. And so I leave you with this. I think if we think about the history of Black women's activism, whether it's in sports or otherwise, and we want to think about how we access these stories, we can read against the grain. We can listen seriously. We can find these moments and dive in deep. There's never going to be a holographic sign saying, this is where Black women's archives are. But that doesn't mean the history is hidden. And if we go beyond looking for hidden figures of sports or hidden figures of any point in history and instead say, what happens when we center Black women in this history? How does it change what we know? How does it change how we critically think about these things if we take it seriously? And I think that the long history of Black women's athletic activism and the long history of Black women's activism overall holds the key to many enriching discussions if we pause, find those moments, and dive in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. So now I'm going to introduce Lily Murray, who's a history major. She's also a history honors student who I am working with, as is Dr. Davis. So we're very proud that she's here. Her question is, how can we study the history of lesbian activism to move toward a more radical and inclusive feminism?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here to listen to us talk. And it's also great to have them here and also very scary because they know the most about what I'm talking about. So we'll see if they do well. On July 4th, 1966, a large group of very well-dressed individuals gathered outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The women, as seen here, donned tailored knee-length dresses and men sported collared shirts and ties. They were not there to celebrate the July 4th holiday in style. Instead, they were there to picket at an event known as the Annual Reminder, at which they were demonstrating for equal rights for homosexuals. Carrying signs, like the one here, shown with Barbara Giddings, while following strictly preset dress codes, they were utilizing tactics of assimilationism. These tactics epitomized the homophile activism of the 1950s and 60s. Focused heavily on properly fighting for legal rights through the system while remaining respectability of the homosexual, the movement towed the line between assimilationism and liberation. These tactics were vital to these homophile groups, including group Daughters of Bilitis, DOB, of whom Barbara Giddings is a member. So the founders of DOB, lesbian couple Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, decided that they wanted to, in 1955, create a lesbian space that differed from those that already existed, which were full of the lower class, less respectable lesbians, the butches and femmes of the working class bar culture. So, instead, they wanted a space in which they and other lesbians could learn, interact, share ideas and experiences. So to do so, to share their experiences on a larger scale, they started meeting not only in person, but created a magazine entitled The Ladder. And plug for the exhibit, we have some copies in the exhibit right now. So in their mission statement, which is placed on the inside of every issue, they state that they are a, quote, women's organization for the purpose of promoting the integration of the homosexual into society. So to do so, they suggest that the lesbian, or the variant, as they call her, must first learn about herself. Then, when she knows what there is to learn about herself and being a lesbian, she can move and spread the news of the lesbian to the world. And this news was that she was just like all straight women. The only difference was with whom she was sleeping. So, this framing of sexuality as a matter of only with whom you're sleeping, and nothing else, no notable differences or characteristics, makes me think about their activism as passing. Therefore, they were trying to pass as heterosexual, trying to pass as respectable. To do so, to pass into straight society and assimilate into heterosexual culture, makes sense because it's 1950 and you know, discrimination. So of course that made sense. That's what they wanted to do. But to do so, they suggested that lesbians, quote, adopt behavior and dress acceptable to society, as this respectable appearance and disposition would allow them to fly under the radar and be inconspicuous along the heterosexual majority. The goal was, as I stated, to pass in many ways. To pass as respectable, to pass as normal, to pass as heterosexual, all culminating in their entrance into proper society. So beginning in a time when homosexuality was deviant and, if discovered, could cause one to lose their job, members of Daughters of Bilitis did have great courage to gather in a group and openly declare their homosexuality and organize on behalf of it. They were putting their jobs, their lives at risk, and a lot of other things alongside it. So while their organization didn't last the turn toward radicalism of the late 20th century, other homosexual rights organizations owe it to this group that, albeit conformist, still helped create the space in which these later radical groups could use their radical tactics to fight for gay rights. So what can be learned from these women? They left behind valuable evidence of how to and how not to organize. From them, we can learn about how privilege works in activist settings and how oppression manifests in these groups because of it. We can learn about the struggles of those before us and how they did and did not deal with the complexities of things like race, gender, and class, as assimilation and respectability are pretty much exclusively a thing for white people to access. So from them, we can also learn a much more complex queer history. People were demonstrating far before Stonewall. Queer history didn't start then. And these people who had been organizing for a long time before 1969 had a lot of goals and aspirations that ranged pretty wildly. Gay liberation swept in only a few years after this annual reminder picket. And this reminds us that a monolithic memory of any movement, like gay rights happening at Stonewall, does not only a disservice to those involved in the movement, like Barbara Giddings, but also a disservice to ourselves, as we lose valuable information from which we today can learn to radicalize our own activism.
Thank you so much, Lily. Our next presenter is Dr. Jaime Schultz, Associate Professor of Kinesiology. And her question is, female athletes have historically received very little attention from activists and advocates for gender equality. Why?
Thank you very much. So that's not actually my question.
Oh.
That question comes from a journalist named Maggie Mertens, who writes for The Atlantic. But I think it's a great question. She wrote it in 2015, and I think it's still relevant, which is why I'm so grateful to have sport included in this wonderful launch event. And it's so interesting that two of us are talking about sport here when it's oftentimes so ignored. So rather than offer answers, I'd like to take this brief time to outline three connections between organized sport and women's activism, with the hope that it will encourage others to take on Merton's query. Those connections are activism for sport, activism in sport, and activism through sport. In the first, I mean women's efforts to get in the game. This history goes back as far as the history of sport, as women agitated and organized for the chance to compete. They also dared to put their physical abilities on public display in order to break down the stereotypes and prejudices that held them back for so long. Examples include Gertrude Ederle, who in 1926 was not only the first woman to swim the English Channel, but she did it breaking the existing men's record by more than 2 hours. And the scores of women who crashed men's marathons before they were officially allowed to run in 1972. And Althea Gibson, who in the 1950s and 1960s desegregated both tennis and golf, two bastions of lily-white elitism. We also have to acknowledge that some women are still fighting for access to sport. Runners Dudi Chand and Caster Semenya have gone to court to push back against the regulations that force them to lower their natural testosterone in order to compete in women's sport. And there are currently 21 bills pending in state legislatures that would bar trans athletes from competing as their lived gender in high school sport. Make no mistake, this is specifically about girls' sport. Second, women's activism in sport takes on many forms, including lobbying for equal pay, as we have seen in tennis and soccer. It might come through coaches speaking out, whether it's Rutgers basketball coach Vivian Stringer defending her team against the racist misogyny of a radio shock jock, or the wildly successful hockey coach Shannon Miller, who lost her job and successfully sued her institution for discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and for Title IX retaliation. Or Notre Dame coach Muffet McGraw, who used her press conference to criticize the lack of women in positions of power. In the same instance, McGraw also decried the lack of a federal equal rights amendment and expressed her commitment to hiring only women on her staff. Activism in sport also includes athletes speaking out against abusive coaches, physicians, organizations, and systems, as well as demanding greater consideration for pregnancy and maternity. These are not sport issues. These are women's issues. And finally, women use their athletic platform to draw attention to larger social concerns. There's much ado about NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem, or before him, Tommy Smith and John Carlos protesting racial inequality on the 1968 Olympic podium. But at that same Olympic Games, Wyoming Attias, who Dr. Davis mentioned, issued the same statement by wearing black shorts instead of the team's official white shorts. Later asked why this gesture received no attention, Attias answered, "Because I was a woman who cared." Gymnast Vera Kozlowska, who's on the far left there, likewise used the 1968 Olympic podium to protest the Soviet invasion of her Czechoslovakian homeland. Yet these stories rarely make the news. Neither do the stories of countless athletes who bravely stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement or the variety of other social causes. This includes the American Indian high school athletes who refused to allow the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women to go on in silence. It also includes athletes who sacrifice their careers and extract themselves from sport for issues of social justice. And so, if we return to Merton's question as to why female athletes and sport figures receive so little recognition for their activist work, there are certainly a host of answers. But we can also turn to Norway's Ada Hegerberg, who's referenced on the right-hand side of the slide, who once commented that it is impossible to be in football, soccer, and not fight for equality. For these and so many other reasons, activists and advocates for gender equality must pay greater attention to women's sport. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz, and thank you for mentioning the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I didn't realize you were going to do that. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Stephanie Scott, who is a liberal arts alumna. And her question is, how do immigrant women navigate their hybrid identities?
Thank you to all the presenters who went before and for the invitation to speak on the panel. Today I'd like to talk briefly about how activist Irish American women writers worked to dismantle a commodified vision of Irishness that took hold in the 1980s and 90s. I'll focus my talk particularly on a woman named Nuala Archer, a first-generation Irish American poet. A bit of context to begin. While Ireland has long been one of the main producers of immigrants to the United States, one of the heavier waves of Irish American immigration occurred in the 1980s and 90s. This was known as the New Irish Wave. As our presentations thus far have demonstrated, at this time, the United States was coming off a period of rapid social and cultural change. The civil rights and gay rights movement had occupied much of the 60s and 70s. Loving versus Virginia invalidated prohibitions against interracial marriage in 67. The Supreme Court had established women's right to choose in 73, and for the first time, contraception was widely available to both single and married women. Many Americans felt apprehensive about how quickly more liberal racial and sexual values had appeared on the scene, and they looked for reassurance that they could slow the progression of change, if not reverse it entirely. The new Irish immigrant population was particularly useful to them in this regard. Ireland's early 20th century fight for independence had coalesced around a vision of a pure Irish race, in contradistinction to their British colonizers. Likewise, the Catholic Church's outsized role in Ireland meant that conservative values, such as the primacy of the family, opposition to divorce, abortion, and same-sex marriage, were quite literally enshrined in the Irish Constitution. Irishness thus became an aspirational identity for some Americans. The New York Times went so far as to call Irishness a designer ethnicity that people could purchase their way into, as indicated by the Times quotation shown here, touting Irish-themed weekends in the Catskills and a sleek new magazine about Irish identity, as well as the print ads shown here. The first on the left for mead, a drink that was associated with marriage and fertility in Celtic mythology, and the second on the right for a claddagh ring, a traditional symbol of love, loyalty, and friendship. These advertisements didn't appear only in major national newspapers, though. They also appeared in Irish American periodicals, nudging the new Irish immigrants to buy back, in effect, the Irish identity many felt that they had lost during emigration. Generations of Irish women have relied on literature as a vehicle for addressing social and political issues that, because of Ireland's long-standing conservatism, have tended to be swept under the rug. Nuala Archer is part of a generation of activist Irish-American women writers who took issue with this aspirational Irishness, and in particular, with the conservative racial and sexual values it espoused. In her poetry, Archer rebukes the American consumer culture that props up this identity, and she champions the gritty intimacy and interdependence of immigrant women. One of Archer's most well-known poems is Sheila Nagin Around, the title of which refers to a mythological Celtic fertility goddess. In this poem, as you see on the screen, Archer criticizes the dead voices that colonize through constitutions and cornerstones, through greeting cards, textbooks, and tourist attractions. She also suggests that the spatial and temporal displacement of immigration allows Irish women to reject conservative sexual values and instead imagine other forms of intimacy, including lesbian intimacy. The poem's speaker describes her banshee Sheila, or sexuality, as springing to life in the embrace of another woman, fittingly enough, as it were, on America's Independence Day. In an allusion to the Star-Spangled Banner, the sexually liberated speaker demands visibility, asking, "Oh, say, can you see? Oh, say, why can't you see?" You might note the capitalized O that Archer uses, a nod to the speaker's newly realized orgasmic potential. In Lady Liberty Talks, Archer broadens her criticism of aspirational Irishness to challenge conservative racial values. The poem's speaker invites women from places as far as Russia, Cambodia, El Salvador, Ireland, Japan, and Haiti, Panama, and Africa, to escape from what she describes as the cash and carry hurry, the Allstate insurance, and the insistence of MasterCard, all seen in New York City's consumer culture. Playing with the trope of the Statue of Liberty as a beacon for weary and lost immigrants, Archer recasts the statue as a monument to immigrant women's shared sexual and emotional vulnerability. In the final lines of the poem, which you see on the screen, the speaker borrows from Emma Lazarus. The diverse immigrant women melt down together figuratively in the metaphorical melting pot that is the U.S., and only then does their huddled mass, another nod to sexuality, finally breathe free. Archer's but one example of the many Irish-American women writers who refused to blindly accept an aspirational Irishness, created in part to assuage others' anxieties. Alice McDermott, who will visit PSU later this month, is another example, as is Yvonne Boland. These writers push us to ask the question, today as ever, how do immigrant women, thousands of miles from home, and weighed down by heteropatriarchal and capitalist expectations, navigate their hybrid identities? And more than that, what role do literature and the arts play in their doing so? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Our next presenter is Courtney Murray. She is a graduate student in the Department of English, and her question is, how does recentering women's activism and experiences challenge current understandings of the Me Too movement?
I only made it to the podium from all the way down there. But okay, so thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the other presenters that went before me. I want to clear that I will be focusing on Black women's activism. So after commenting on the quote-unquote personal violence most Black women endured while traveling during the late 19th century, Anna Julia Cooper, educator, civil rights activist, and author, once reflected on a train ride by writing, quote, "And when farther on in the same section, our train stops at a dilapidated station, and we're looking a little more closely, I see two dingy little rooms with four ladies swinging over one and for colored people over the other, while wondering under which head I come," unquote. In this moment, Cooper grapples with the following questions. Which restroom do I use? If I am Black, am I not a woman? If I am a woman, am I not Black? But there's another layer that must be added to understand the complexities of this intersectional moment. If you add Cooper being the progeny of a non-consensual slave-master relationship, how does this restroom experience connect Cooper to the Me Too movement? Being neither recognized as a woman nor biologically black or white, Cooper in this moment illuminates how these signs erase her being. Because of that erasure, she would never receive any redress if she were to be a victim of sexual assault during her trip. Scouring through her archives, I found other autobiographical moments that could further tie Cooper to a tradition that appears in the current Me Too movement. Women telling, retelling, writing, rewriting their ties to sexual assault and abuse for a higher purpose. In my digital project titled Me Too and Black Women Voices, a case study of Angela Cooper's Me Too struggle through her work, I investigated how Cooper employed forums, newspaper articles, essays, and poetry, not only to highlight black women's long history with sexual assault and abuse, but also as spaces to struggle with her own identity, being the product of rape herself, being mixed race rather than pure black. Thus, can one argue that Me Too has existed long before 2006 in the archives, writings, and activism of black women before us? This project by no means proposes that we merely define Cooper as a product of sexual assault, but what I highlight is that black women are the queens of covert signification in their writing and activism. From some scholars arguing that Pauline Hopkins and others employed the mulatto figure or symbol to respectively showcase the impact of rape and uncontrolled white male desire, to Cooper speaking up for quote-unquote colored girls like her, black women from Phyllis Wheatley to now have been whispering, writing, yelling, Me Too. I'm a woman too, I'm a writer too, I'm a mother too, and so on and so on. You just have to look for it, you just have to listen to their voices. I conclude my project with questions like, is Me Too still for black women too? Or as Ashwini Tambi in her essay, Reckoning with the Silences of Me Too, has asked, whose pain was being centered, I wondered. Is Me Too a white woman's movement? I added, how can we ensure that all women are being heard, especially those who have experiences tied to sexual assault even before birth? Allison Hobbs in her piece in The New Yorker shows how we can begin answering questions such as these by realizing that, quote, Harriet Jacobs, Reese Taylor, Fannie Lou Hamer, and countless others made great sacrifices, making it possible for more women to tell their stories, but many of us do not know their names. We can create a more inclusive narrative. Every trauma and every testimony has a history. Before we can heal, we have to share those histories and learn and honor them too, unquote. In conclusion, maybe this project can highlight the psychological trauma placed on those born because of rape. How did their voices fit into Me Too, and what did they reveal that is not focused on in the mainstream Me Too movement? Maybe it can highlight the intricacies, shapes, and outlets that these overlooked and omitted voices can take and help us find them. Or even highlight the demarcations in the movement that may be leading attention and help away from the black girls and black women who statistically still need it. Whatever this type of work can do, I hope that it can promote and model how we can extend the bounds of Me Too, reclaiming and reinserting past and present black women voices in the movement, and help others advocate for inclusiveness within the discursive and non-discursive activism inspired by this movement for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. So we have a little bit of time for questions. So we will open it up and invite our audience to ask questions, either revisit some of the questions that were posed. We tried to help you out by giving you some questions to start from, but now it's up to you to continue the discussion. So would anyone like to start us off with a question for any of our panelists?
Hello. So I think that this is all like really interesting, looking at how black women have been involved with activism and how they've been even hidden from that world of activism, and is suffrage for white women, because now I feel like on Twitter we're seeing a lot of live questioning of I feel like it's been just on my Twitter page, black women calling out instances of when they're being excluded from the narrative, and then it and reading the comments, there's a lot of fighting about that. So I just wanted to know any of your input on just on Twitter and what you're seeing and how white women can make sure that when they're tweeting things on Twitter or just like being a part of that conversation, that we're respecting their opinions and also trying to, assist them to be more noticed as well.
Thank you for your question. I just got on Twitter recently, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. But I think that your question also relates to a lot of different areas where Black women are also protesting against citational practices that are happening. There's like the hashtag cite Black women also going on. So I guess my best advice would be, like, if you received this information or you don't know where a certain term has stemmed from, you can always try to research it. Just like Dr. Davis says, you have to find this. You can't just, say, highlight, neon sign, this is from a Black woman. So, I always try to make sure, even in my papers or anything that I do, that I know where the term comes from. I know where the hashtag comes from. Because I think that when Me Too actually started, there was this instance of it just being kind of taken up without even any credit to Tarana Burke, who actually started it back in 2006. So, I think that's what I can suggest.
Yeah, Twitter. I think that, the other thing to remember is that there's two kind of pieces of the conversation. There's two pieces of the conversation. One is the citational practice, the understanding of, if you're saying, what does pay equity look like, right? Well, it's 70 cents on the dollar for white women, and then you can just keep going down from there when you add other women in. But also it's the appropriation of terms that then get decontextualized. So intersectionality is now mainstream. I saw 4 pieces last week that were discussing how a person can be intersectional, right? And so that's a really great example of people not doing the reading, not doing the work, but using the language and fashioning the language as a politic in and of itself. And so intersectionality, to understand the origins of that, is not a kind of oppression Olympics type of, we're all intersectional in some way, but it's specifically grounded in understanding the twin burdens that Black women shoulder. And so I think that those are moments that happen a lot on Twitter, because in 240 characters, what is it, 280 now? 280, you can do a lot of things, but nuance is hard. And it's a lot easier to use rhetoric and not actually engage in it and sit with it. And I think a lot of times it's just about being uncomfortable. Wading into new conversations means learning how to listen actively. It means getting in the mess and the gunk, and I think that is the best thing anybody can do. And then also knowing when to log off, right? There's sometimes that I have a cartoon on my door that's I can't go to bed, somebody's wrong on the internet, and the hours you waste. And so part of that is really instructive, right, though, about coalition building. You can spend 5 hours getting I do this is a self-drag and implication, getting in the weeds, right? But then it's also about these moments where you're do I want to continue to engage online through Twitter, or do I want to use Twitter to find other communities that perhaps I can build with? And so I think those are the other kind of ways of reframing those moments. So if you're in mentions and you're finding people who are saying things that you're yeah, not only follow them, amplify those accounts, and then also ask, how can I help, right? So I think that those are some of the ways to think about often fraught debates that happen on social media platforms.
And I would just add, I think it's interesting, I have one. You mentioned in your talk, right, the platform, the idea of a platform, and certainly historically, Black women's voices or other women of color have not necessarily had access to a platform that reaches particularly white audiences. And Twitter and social media has its problems, right, for sure, but it does allow for a much wider conversation where people can push back and be critical, and I think that's really exciting. Yeah, just to listen and amplify is also really important.
A lot of the talks today focused on how women of color, and especially African American women, were seen as like only allowed one identity rather than being like an activist and an athlete. Let's say they were only allowed to be an athlete, and then their complete like activist identity was like erased. What are some continuing reasons do you think that like why this happens, and how can we kind of stop that going forward?
That's a good question. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes it's about what our core definitions of normal look like. So particularly like with women athletes, it's a great example. When we think of athletic activism, a lot of times we think about activism centered around racial inequality. And so we miss the great things Dr. Schultz showed about pay equity, right? We miss maternity politics. On the flip side, when we think about issues of pay equity and professionalization opportunities, we think of it as women's issues, and the default there is white women. So a lot of times, historically and now, it's getting caught between those kind of unsaid normative meanings. And so I think that one of the ways to combat that is always reasserting, like, no, actually, you're not saying the word white here, but you mean white women, right? You're not saying the word men here, but you mean black men, right? And so I think that being very intentional in that regard makes some of what's usually rendered invisible, and thus what's really power, which is what that is, when it's rendered invisible, it's harder to see, and a lot of times we slip into it without knowing we're doing that. And so actually just the power of naming that and illuminate some of these sites where people are claiming multiple parts of their identity. And I think that that's part of what everybody is speaking on, were those moments where you have all these kind of collapsing of identities. And so that a lot of things are just literally the same in that regard.
And I would add to that, too, that in some ways it's about kind of training ourselves to reread. So, we get these kind of stock narratives. And think about Black History Month, think about Women's History Month, and how that traditionally gets deployed. So you'll have these key figures. And so you get this narrative of these kind of lone, isolated figures. And a lot of that just doesn't represent or doesn't allow space for much more complex identities, for the kinds of work that a lot of women of color, Black women, were engaged in. So that those kinds of narratives can erase that work. So I think, especially with Dr. Davis's talk, really getting us to think about, in everyone's comments, getting us to rethink how we read, what our practices are, how we do research, where we're willing to look, to really just get behind and beyond these kinds of ready-made narratives that sometimes get handed down to us. So we have time for one more question? Okay.
I didn't want to be the last question. So in thinking about the writing of narratives and history and that type of thing, are any of you involved in anything that is working on rewriting history books and the women's role in history for our school systems? And how are we educating the youth with regards to this? Or do you know of ways for community to be involved in that? Because, just looking at how these history textbooks and the things that are used with youth, from different states are telling different stories, how can we get better representation for everyone?
So I'm currently writing my thesis on, this was like basically what I covered was the first chapter. And while I don't quite have the capacity to write a textbook, what I'm interested in is kind of like, right now, a little busy, is thinking about, right, so I will have finished my thesis and I'll have like a hefty 60-page document and be like, who wants to learn about lesbians? But like, that's a really hard thing to digest. So what I've been thinking a lot about recently is like, what does the, like, why does the medium matter? So if I'm going to say like, hey, do you want to learn something? And I'm like, great, read my thesis. They're going to be like, I don't know about that. So what I've been thinking about is how could I maybe turn my topic into a zine? How could I digitize this? How could I think about how to incorporate primary, secondary materials in a way that makes it more, accessible? Because truthfully, that's so much more fun than reading my 60-page thesis, and it would be fun for me to make.
And Lily has done great work. I want her to tell you this on Wikipedia and Wikithons, editing thons. And so now you talk about that.
Yeah.
But like, I think this is
Yeah. So while I'm wearing my history hat, I'm also an intern at the libraries. And so something that I've been thinking a lot about is like, how do we again like learn these things? And one of them is everyone uses Wikipedia, but everyone says don't use Wikipedia. So there's this huge dissonance between the reality of what's happening with Wikipedia. And therefore, if we don't treat it like it's valid, then the only people editing it are like not the critical people, and therefore sometimes Wikipedia pages are bad. So it's this way of thinking about how can we, so I've hosted Wikipedia editathons in which we think about, how can we make this better? And how can we think about knowledge as something that we all have a reason to partake in? So why should I, as somebody who doesn't have a PhD, be able to edit information? It's because I care and I actually do know things. Same with everybody in this room. So, that's kind of this reframing. So while it's not, and I think that's one way to kind of like reframe what does Wikipedia mean. Yeah, maybe don't cite right from it, because whatever, citations are a whole thing, that's a thing. But, but there are these things where like we're all allowed to author information, and I think that incorporating these things in high schools, so saying, you 15-year-old student, no, you don't have a college degree, but you know things and can edit these things, and we've done things by using special collections materials, so you're able to, we made a Wikipedia page for a Penn State queer history group, so just this way of, I think like mixing mediums is I think like the way that I think about it most. So mostly that, just like how can we do it differently in a way that more people can actually get their hands on it, like a zine or like Wikipedia.
Thank you. And I won't say that was the last question. That was the question that is going to allow us to segue into the man assembly room, where we will be able to have all of these questions and more to continue the discussion with our panelists and with each other. And I just want to reiterate Lily's point that I can't attribute this, but there was this saying that used to circulate in folklore studies that someone else can write the textbooks, I'll write the fairy tales. And, so thinking about all the different ways in which we can, share and circulate information beyond just, what's happening in kind of the approved secondary or elementary classroom. And so that kind of allows us to segue a little bit more into some of the other questions that we wanted to pose, and that's to kind of throw it back to the audience. And so we have 3 additional questions, and those questions are, what does activism mean to you? Where do we go from here? And how do we make a difference? And so we really do want people to think about, this entire year being devoted not only to having this discussion today, but this discussion today as really a jumping off point to thinking, maybe you don't write textbooks and that's not your thing. But, what are the many different ways in which you can be engaged in working with others to affect change? So again, we're going to continue, we have a few housekeeping notes, so we're going to continue the conversation in the main assembly room, where there will be a pop-up exhibit of some of the library's collections on women's activism, as well as an interactive place to leave comments. Just a little teaser, there are playing cards, there's suffragist and anti-suffragist playing cards. Like, if you haven't seen that, you've got to go over. right? And there's a Me Too artist book, posters, books, magazines, rare artifacts, letters, and really everything from the very serious representations to quite playful. But on the serious note, there will be refreshments, but you'd have to keep them on the side of the room away from the document. That's in bold and underlined here, so I was told to say that. So, Kathleen?
Very quickly, remember the League of Women Voters, the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters is there if you want to register to vote. I think there's a representative from the census. They're looking for people to work, and someone from the School of Public Policy. Also, be aware that there is a webpage where you can find future events as well as a hashtag, so you can tweet them and spread the word, right? So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to continuing this. The man room is just over here right before Starbucks. You'll see the big posters that look like this. So thank you all for coming.